here I am with Nijay, continuing our various discussions on biblical studies. This time, Philemon, you're not Philemon, you're Nijay. This time, Nijay, we're not going to be looking at Romans. We're taking a break from Romans for a moment, and we're going to do Paul's letter to Philemon, or as you Americans pronounce it, I believe, Philemon or something, or Philemon, or I don't know. How do you Americans pronounce it?
It's, it sounds like a delicious fish cutlet as Philemon, but Philemon, we'll go with traditional.
Okay, or the we'll go with the Queen's English. Go with the Queen's English. Yeah, that sounds good. So Nijay, what are you doing with Philemon these days?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So I just taught a course on Philippians and Philemon, so I got to spend a lot of time in that with my students. Had a really good time with that. I just completed Oxford Bibliography's online entry on Philemon. I was surprised they hadn't had one. They have one on pretty much all of Paul's letters. So I've spent the last about 6 months reading, really every major work on Philemon published in the last, I'd say, 20, 30 years. And there's a lot, and so there's a lot to talk about. And then I'm working on New Testament theology for Cambridge Press on Philippians and Philemon. So it's been fun to work in a short text, a very, very short text like that. But Mike, I know that you've done some work on Philemon. I know for sure that you did your New Covenant commentary on Colossians and Philemon. I looked at that little section on Philemon in that commentary. What else have you done on Philemon? I know it comes into play in lots of different things that you work on.
Well, it's sort of, obviously you got the commentary there, but also whenever you're dealing with Paul's theology, whenever you're doing Paul on the topic of slavery, it really is kind of ground zero in that discussion, because, we all want Paul to say, hey, Philemon, you should totally manumit, because don't you know slavery is wrong, brother?
Right.
That's kind of what we're all wanting Paul to say. But I mean, for me, that's the one big issue is, the sort of the slavery issue. The other issue is what I would call the ethics of pastoral persuasion, because Paul really does, lay it on Philemon pretty hard, trying to get him to do what he wants to do. He says, "Of course, I could order you to do this, but I would never do that. Instead, I'm just going to put you in an impossible situation before the whole church where you have to do what I want you to do, or you'll become completely shamed. But I definitely don't want to manipulate you in any way. It's because the letter is addressed to Philemon,
You're having trouble with that name.
To Apphia, to Archippus, and to the church that meets in your home. So this isn't a one-on. This is written to, this is the two guys, the husband or wife / sister, the kind of the interim pastor, Archippus, and to the church. So this is being played out publicly, and this is what people often don't realize. So they're the two things I'm interested in. I should give a shout out. I've got a PhD student, Dr. Jason Park, who's looking at Philemon through the lens of manumission and economic theory. So he's looking at the economics of manumission in the ancient world. Was it always cheaper to have a slave rather than hired labor? What was the economics and the situation of slavery in the interior of Asia Minor? Because it's one thing being a slave in a silver mine, in northern Greece, or working on a farm, or being a tutor for someone's children. So Dr. Jason Park is looking at a thesis on that, and that's been some really interesting stuff that he's been coming up with.
Let's take a step back and talk about the situation and background. I remember John Barclay in his introduction to Colossians and Philemon talking about Philemon as perhaps the most puzzling Pauline letter. And I think he means not because of the content, but because we have trouble grasping the situation. The situation would have been obvious to Paul, to Philemon, to Onesimus, and to the church. The situation eludes us, but there are lots and lots and lots of theories. And so, why don't you start off? I'll mention some theories. Why don't you start off with summarizing kind of the traditional theory that goes back at least to John Chrysostom, but is famously articulated by Lightfoot and others, the fugitivist theory. Can you explain that briefly, Mike?
So that's the idea that Onesimus is a slave who's done something to tick off Philemon, and he says, "That's it. I've had a gutful. I'm just going to leg it, and I'm going to run. I'm just going to run to the biggest city I can find. I'm going to run to Rome." And while he's there, he gets caught and arrested and gets put in a cell. And who's in the cell next to him? None other than the Apostle Paul.
Right.
What a coincidence. Right. And so it's like, hey, Paul, it's like, Onesimus, what are you doing here? This isn't Colossae. What are you doing here? He says, well, I ran away and I got caught, and I'm now here I am. And they're going to send me back to old man Philemon. He's going to give me a butt whooping when I get back. And then during that time, he comes to faith, and then Paul. So he's a runaway slave who gets caught, and he's then in prison with Paul in Rome.
Yeah, so that's like the fugitivist theory. It's extremely common. Even many scholars today still hold to that. A theory that emerged, I think, in the 70s, 80s, is the idea that Philemon was actually sent. Onesimus was sent by the church to Paul, because nowhere does it specifically say that he's run away. And one of the big questions that's asked about the situation is if he actually ran away and committed a crime, a Roman crime. Paul can't just send him back willy-nilly. There are legal issues involved. It's kind of like if a church in America would kind of give amnesty to an illegal immigrant or something like that. You can say all you want in the church, but there's still legal issues involved in those kinds of things. So that's one theory. It hasn't been really very popular, I think, because Paul talks about having wronged him, right? He says if he's wronged you in any way, and that makes it feel like there's that Onesimus has done something wrong, and Paul is trying to send him back, saying forgive him. Another theory which emerged through Peter Lampe is called the amicus domini theory, which means friend of the master. Do you want to explain this one, since it's become kind of the dominant view now?
Yep. That's the view that Onesimus hasn't actually run away. He's just fled to a friend of the master, hoping the master will intercede. So obviously, Onesimus has done something bad, like knocked over his favorite, vase, or, kind of like more likely than not made a really big business transaction that's gone terrible, and or something along those lines. So he knows he's going to get a really hard time from the master. So he basically runs to someone the master respects, a friend, a leader, a mentor, a colleague, asking him to intercede for him to help him calm down. And we do have a good example with this, I believe, from antiquity. We've got, what is it? Is it Tacitus?
I think it's Pliny.
Pliny
to Sabianus or something like that.
Yeah, to Sabianus, where it's not a slave, it's a freedman who runs to Pliny, saying, look, can you put a good word in for me with my former slave master Sabianus, because this guy's going to be really ticked off at me. And Pliny says, in effect, look, I know he's a good-for-nothing slave, and you have every right to give him a hard time, but, there is a place for mercy in our world, and he seems very contrite, so, be a sport. Give him a break this time. Let this one go through to the keeper.
Yeah, I think a number of scholars today take that view. I remember Joseph Fitzmyer is a really strong advocate of that view. I think John Barclay is warm to that view, even though I think he's non-committal in his book. And then Jimmy Dunn, I think, also subscribes to that view. I want to mention a few more, and then I want to ask you kind of how we assess these things. One theory which has not caught on, but continues to be discussed because it's something to process, is what if Onesimus is Philemon's actual brother? So I think this is Callahan.
Yep.
I think Dwight Callahan argues this and says he's not actually a slave. This is maybe more of a metaphor. Don't treat him poorly, but treat him like he is your actual brother. It just doesn't feel like the pieces fit together for that to work very well. I want to mention a theory that's put into Bruce Longenecker's little commentary in the Paideia series that's packaged together with Philippians. Longenecker surveys all the different views, but then he says, what if, not that Onesimus is his true biological brother, but maybe a half-brother who was born from a female slave of the same father. So the father who's the master. And, all his life he's been treated as a slave. And now, he's saying, receive him back as a beloved brother, treat him as family as he is for your family. So we have all these theories: runaway, amicus, perhaps he was sent, maybe he's the real brother, half brother. Mike, Barclay has a point. This is really tough to adjudicate, and yet it does play into how we interpret the letter. How if you can kind of go back into your own head and thinking when you're writing your commentary or in more recent work, maybe that you did for the New Testament, its world, how do you weigh all these theories? And then another question, how much significance should that play in how we actually interpret the letter? Can we interpret the letter without a situational theory?
Yeah, that's a good question, Nijay. Yes, some of them all the theories have weight because they explain or they highlight something that's in the text.
Yeah.
So obviously the runaway slave is kind of what you might naturally think when you read this, but then you realize, well, that's not the only category. And we have this example of Pliny's letter to Sabianus, about a absconded slave who that makes sense. And you're going to say, would a slave in Central Asia Minor run all the way to Rome or Ephesus is, I think, more likely to do something like that? And what's the coincidences of being, in the same prison cell with Paul if he was just randomly captured again? So it's all sort of factors like that. And Callahan's theory is interesting because he takes the brotherhood language seriously and makes that a controlling theme. But the funny thing there is he wants to take the slave language metaphorically and the brother language literally. So he kind of inverts. We normally think the slavery is literal and the brotherhood language is kind of fictive or metaphorical. So he's just kind of flipping on the way people normally do stuff, which in one sense can be illuminating because that's the type of, testing and challenging of assumptions. You just take an assumption, you say, well, but what if? And that's how you come up with new perspectives on, early Christianity and the church and theology. Yeah, as to weighing them, it just comes down to explanatory power. What explains about the world we know behind the text, which is always fragmentary and piecemeal? What explains what's happening in the text and what explains the reception of the text? So the best theory is the one that accounts for those three things: the worlds behind, in, and in front of the text. And the more your theory can explain those things, the better I think it's going to be, or the more convincing it is, in my estimation.
If I remember correctly, you lean in favor of the amicus domini. Is that right?
Yeah.
Can you just explain why?
Yeah, look, so I don't think he's a runaway slave, because otherwise he probably would have just been, given maybe a bit of a beating, and then pretty much sent back straight away to Colossae. I don't think they're not going to give him kind of like the pro-slavery league kind of puts in an amicus brief with the local magistrate, or anything like that. I think he'd be, given a bit of a punishment and sent straight back if he was captured. The impression I get is he's gone to Paul deliberately. He sought Paul out, and he does this because he knows of the relationship there is between Philemon and Paul. So that makes me think he's not a runaway slave. So I think and he has done something, but he's done something that's obviously wronged Philemon. That's the language of anything he owes you, a credit, to me. That kind of, the crediting language here, I think is very, very important, quite theological, if you ask me. So I think he's done something wrong and he's sought Paul out, which for me, the most natural, or maybe not the most natural, but the view with the least problems and the one that makes sense, I think, is that he's absconded and gone to the master. That said, I know some people will prefer the fugitive theory or something that's more about a complex family relationship, like you've suggested, like Bruce Longneck has suggested. And I think that makes sense. If a lot of female slaves did produce progeny from their slave masters, then that did create a type of biological relationship, which may be sort of known but not stated, because you can have many children, but only certain legitimate children. And and that can become a point of real contention. I mean, Brutus, I think, was meant to be a son of Julius Caesar, and apparently that's why Brutus stabbed Julius Caesar in his, I quote, loins when he assassinated him, because he never recognized him as his own son, biological son, and that kind of a thing. So that there can be all sort of complex intra-household family politics going on as well.
Something that comes up in this letter is really interesting is, I've heard over the years that if a householder became a Christian in the first century, their whole household, familia, would be converted to that religion. And so, for example, Lydia in the book of Acts, it says she and her household were baptized. Right? So you kind of have this mentality, okay, the slaves are going to follow suit with whatever the master does in terms of religion. But here we have a situation where Philemon is a Christian, but Onesimus, before he meets Paul, is not. What's your take on that? Is this an outlier, or is this the norm? What is your take on how this complicates the picture of the household that goes along with the householder in terms of religion?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, we often just assume that they had corporate solidarity, and the family unit and the paterfamilias called the shots on what cults and what gods and religions were going to be honored by the household. But it shows it's a little bit more complex than that. And some slaves may not want to go along with it. And then you get a similar thing later on, when you'd have a slave who was a Christian but did not want to go along with the master's sort of pagan devotion. So this actually becomes more of an issue for Christian slaves in the later centuries to come. So it goes to show it wasn't so simple as the paterfamilias says, hey, today we're all going to be worshippers of Jupiter. Tomorrow, maybe I'll pick Juno, and the day after that, we'll give Jesus a try. It's a little bit more complex than that, and there is a certain still room for individual devotion, or people not necessarily going along with what's expected of them.
Yeah. One thing that has been asserted about Philemon, even in the patristic era, is that it's not theological. And so the argument, Chrysostom talks about this in his works, and there are other patristic writers that say some people have said that Philemon doesn't offer anything substantial theologically. Now, I think by that they mean there's no hymns like the Philippian Christ hymn. There's no extensive statements on soteriology. There's no quotations from the Old Testament. There's no, kind of embedding of early Christian tradition. So in that sense, it doesn't wear its theology on its sleeve. So Paul doesn't say, do this because Jesus died for you, or do this because this is the kind of tradition of the church. Does this make this a different kind of letter than Paul's other letters? Mike, what's your assessment on the theological value and maybe even the kind of epistolary type that we have here that's very different from even the pastoral epistles, which are written to individuals? We don't have hymns in this letter. It seems more like a personal letter than any of Paul's other letters. How do you assess that?
Yeah, I mean, at one level, this is probably one of Paul's letters that actually is like an ancient letter. Most letters did not take up a whole scroll like a Romans, or a 1 Corinthians. Like Romans is kind of like more like an essay, trying to bolster his apostolic credentials and kind of create some sort of support and capital with the Roman house churches. 1 Corinthians is kind of like where you've got about 15 problems and debates and divisions, and you try to solve every one of them one after another, and kind of talk about moving different people and travel itineraries along the way. But Philemon, this is closer to what an actual letter was like in antiquity. It was kind of a short something you could just put on like a one little page of a notebook sort of a thing, or one little bit of parchment. So this is more closer to the type of literary culture in antiquity. And it goes to show that not everything Paul wrote with these massive tomes, these rhetorical rants, or these massive rebukes, or even kind of deeply theological instructions to churches. Some of it is just dealing with the day-to-day pastoral crises that you come across. And this, I don't think anyone in pastoral ministry would know this. A lot of your stuff is not writing lengthy sermons or manifestos or discourses. Sometimes it's just trying to get, two deacons in your church to see eye to eye, or a couple of Bible study leaders are kind of having debate about what resources they want to use in the next one. I mean, a lot of it's just doing that kind of stuff. So it shows, I think, theology. I think it shows the earthly realism that Paul is dealing with as a apostle, as a church planner, as a leader, as a theologian. He's dealing with everyday aspects of life in the ancient world. I do think this letter is important because it does give us something of an insight into Paul's treatment of slavery. I mean, he does kind of work for the release of Onesimus. I mean, he doesn't come up with a sort of hashtag slave lives matter as we might want him to, but you can see he's trying to push towards a thing where Onesimus does get manumitted and kind of released to Paul's own custody to kind of help him. Now, you can debate whether Paul is trying to acquire a free slave for his own personal use, or more likely he sees here a very talented, albeit troubled man who could be a great asset to him and his ministry, his circle of friends. And he wants to manumit him and to have him released to his own service. But the other thing I think is theological is Paul applies his idea of justification to personal reconciliation. I mean, and particularly if you look at in verse 17. So if you consider me a partner, now what's the Greek word? What's that? Koinos?
Koinos, yeah, koinos.
Okay, so this is real. This is language of fellowship. Yeah. If you consider me koinos, okay, welcome him as you would welcome me. Now, this is precisely what Paul says in Romans 15. Welcome one another as Christ welcomed you. And Paul's saying, look, welcome him as you would welcome. In other words, he's saying to Philemon, I want you to take my status, my relationship with you, and I want you to impute that to him so you would treat him the way you would treat me. And then it works the other way. If he has done anything wrong, if he owes you anything, charge it to me. I mean, this is Paul himself is a little miniature of Christ saying, give me his sin and he can have my status. Right. Okay, so this is as close as you're going to come in the New Testament to a theory of double imputation. Paul says, give him my status and I will take the penalty for what he's done. Okay, I will pay the price for how he has wronged you. That is almost a microcosm of Paul's theology of justification and atonement, of paying someone's sins, the price of their failure, and then having a positive status. So I think that is an inherently theological point, that by itself. And I mean, this is it's ironic that people think Philemon is not theological, yet N.T. Wright's book, Paul and the Faithfulness of God, kicks off quite surprisingly.
Like 80 pages. Yeah,
80 pages on this little kind of entree into Philemon as a great starting point for understanding Paul's theology. And I think this is precisely why. Why would this somewhat Jewish Christian leader of some messianic group in Judea intercede in the slave master debate? And why does what he say is so different from what Pliny says to Sebianus? I mean, there's similar things, but you can see Paul's tackling what I think is a similar thing, but he is deploying some Christological resources to deal with that same problem. And that is what I think is distinctive. And I think this is a real case in applied theology. It's not intensely exegetical. It's not like all allusions to Isaiah and Ezekiel and Genesis. Okay, it's not building some huge Christological edifice like Colossians 1 or Philippians 2, but it's showing what the gospel looks like when its principles and its beliefs are applied to the messy, dirty, complicated, and heated world of household relationships, in this case between a slave and a master, and yet played out before the entire church to see.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I know a number of scholars that have talked about Philemon as a kind of practical outworking of Galatians 3:27-28, where Paul says neither slave nor free, and this is, Paul is not saying he's eliminating legal status, he's eliminating gender, he's eliminating ethnic status or ethnic identity. He is saying that these things become relativized in koinonia, in Christ. And so that's really powerful. I'll also say a key word in Philemon is love. Paul talks about Philemon's love for the saints. And there's an interesting theory by a scholar named Lewis Brogden. I don't know if you've heard this, Mike, but Brogden argues that, and this is just a theory, so it's not able to be proven, but he argues that Philemon was a leader in his house church and that he excluded Christian slaves from fellowship. And Onesimus is not a Christian yet, but sees what's happening and somehow makes his way to Paul to basically say, this needs to stop. And then Paul sends him back as a kind of case study. Another interesting point to bring up, I read an article recently by Peter Head, our mutual British friend, and he makes a really, really good case that Onesimus is the letter carrier. And part of the reason that Paul is somewhat ambiguous with his concrete advice is that Philemon has to make his decision face to face with Onesimus as Paul's agent, as his proxy. And that holds some power as well. I think this idea that Paul doesn't give Philemon these very specific directives because he has given Onesimus kind of his agency powers to be able to negotiate that. And that really brings a whole new picture to that relationship, because it's not just about a letter, it's about what's happening through the letter carrier as well. I think that's fascinating. Well, you talked about verse 17. I want to talk about verse 16, which is probably the most controversial verse in the letter, because it's hard to know exactly what Paul means when he says, receive him back as more than a slave, as a beloved brother. Does more than a slave mean that Paul is putting pressure on Philemon to give Onesimus his legal freedom, manumission? So we use a different term for those who don't know. We don't say, abolition or anything like that, because that's a widespread thing. When it's about an individual, we refer to it as manumission. I think that was a popular theory in certain parts of the 20th century. It's fallen out of favor. Scholars like Scott McKnight and others, I can't remember what you say, Mike, but they said, this isn't Paul's priority. His priority is the relationship within the church. He's not necessarily telling him to set him free from slavery. And yet now we're starting to see a few voices start to say, no, I think actually he might be saying, give him his freedom. I remember John Barclay saying, just to complicate this, John Barclay saying, well, if he gives Onesimus his freedom, are the other slaves in the household going to say, what about us? And so that adds another level of complexity to the picture. What's your take when you read verse 16? Is this Paul saying, give Onesimus his legal freedom?
Yeah, I think it's implying that, the natural conclusion to this is to him to set him free. But even then, that doesn't mean becoming absolute free, like a free agent in your football talk. Effectively, he could become a freedman, which means he can no longer be sort of strictly controlled and ordered, but he's still dependent and subordinate. So it's going from like a social status of being a nothing. It's like from being a nothing to being a nobody. Is kind of, so it's a step
it's
up.
A small, yeah.
It's a step up the chain, but it's not fantastic. So even if he's going from slave to freedman, I mean, it's a big deal, but it's not the big deal that we might think it is. Okay, but manumission was also common. Okay, manumission was common. So I don't think that the sight of one person being manumitted would make all the slaves suddenly revolt and say, but I'm Spartacus. No, I'm Spartacus, and lead to a kind of slave result. Seeing people manumitted or slaves kind of leveled up from slave to freedman that wasn't uncommon, and I don't think it would have prompted a massive demand for the same treatment for everyone.
Also, legally, freedmen were required to treat their former masters as patrons, and sometimes there was a contract. I think often there was a contract that they had to serve a number of days as a kind of low-wage employee for their master. So you're right; it wasn't just clean and done, and you can go move somewhere else and have a separate life. I want to read you something from Epictetus, because this often is brought into the discussion. I think Marcus Bart brings this into discussion. So Epictetus was a slave who becomes a freedman, and then goes on to become a philosopher and does all this writing. And one of his works, dissertations, he says this. He says, "Once I am freed," the slave says, "at once everything will be great. I will not care for anybody. I speak freely and on equal level with all people, and I go wherever I want." Then Epictetus says, "But whereupon he is freed, but since he has nothing to eat, at once he seeks someone to flatter in order to get food. He hires out his body and suffers the worst. Even when somewhere he finds a crib, he has fallen into slavery far worse than the former. He is unhappy, deplores himself, and yearns back for the slave status. What kind of evil did I suffer, he will say. Another person gave me shoes, clothing, food, nursed me when I was sick, and I rendered him but few services. Miserable man that I am now, since I have to serve several people instead of one." How much of an exaggeration is this?
I don't think it is, because again, you have to remember, and this is the hardest thing to communicate. You can get shouted down for this, but slavery was a horrible, deplorable, exploitive system, but it was also pretty much the only welfare system they had. Yeah. Okay, so I mean, I'm not trying to say, hey, slavery was great, but the reality is that if you reach the point of poverty, you could sell yourself into slavery. You were owned. Your body could be done with anything that you did not necessarily want. But as Epictetus says, someone else has to now keep you and look after you and feed you, and that's better than being a bandit, a prostitute, and a beggar. For some people, or because you can be a day laborer, but you just don't know when your next meal's coming from. So you can see how for some people, slavery did have its benefits, if I can say. It wasn't ideal. It wasn't good. It wasn't without a price or without suffering. But it had to be weighed up, and it was kind of like the only welfare system they had. And that's what you've got to remember. And in some cases, having a freedman or having whether laborers or slaves were more economic expediently is a little bit unclear. It's not always the case that slaves were cheaper than freedmen, depending on what your context is and the business and the location. So it's economically, it's going to be a little bit more different depending on which part of the world you're in. But I think that the thing is right. Getting your freedom may not necessarily be all it's cracked up to be, because you've now got a whole bunch of other sort of messy issues and complicated things in life you've now got to deal with.
We're running down on time. I want to ask you the big question, which all my students ask, and definitely there's no easy answer. But why didn't Paul denounce slavery and recommend all slaves of Christians, become free? I mean, this would be an easy case where Paul could say, hey, listen, slavery's bad. We can't advocate for abolition because we're Christians. We Christians are a small group. But, in this case, we can. You have the pastoral epistles, you have the household codes, you have all kinds of places in Paul where 1 Corinthians 7, perhaps, where he reinforces slavery. And actually, Philemon was used, as you probably know, Mike, in the abolition, conversations in America and the UK. Philemon was brought up as a text to say, hey, Christian slaves shouldn't run away. They shouldn't rebel. They should stay good, docile, obedient slaves. What do we do with that? Because obviously we know that slavery is wrong. We as Christians seek to end slavery in the world now. But how do we look back to Paul and how do we reflect on this hero of ours, the Apostle Paul, where in places in his letters, I think of 1 Timothy 6, I think of the household codes, where he says, hey, slaves, obey your masters. What do you do with that in light of questions today and throughout time about power, freedom, and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, part of it we obviously lament. We obviously wish Paul was like us, had our sort of more enlightened views on freedom and the like. But we do have to remember, like, the anachronism. Like expecting people in the 21st century to have our values reflected in the first century is just a little bit. So, I mean, if you look at some of the values back in the 1990s. And how they've shifted, like 30. Oh my gosh, look at all those sort of jokes on Friends, making fun of, or go back to the 1970s and look at some of those jokes, how incredibly racist and sexist they are now. So we've got to remember that the world was a different place. They have different values, and many people may have said, "Look, slavery is not ideal, but what else do you do for a welfare system?" Okay, now I'm not trying to defend slavery. I'm trying to get inside the head of people back then who probably knew this was bad, oppressive, and it was wretched, but they also said, well, what's the alternative? Mass starvation, banditry, all sorts of things. So there was some thinking about that. Obviously, some people were taken slaves in bad circumstances through, war, being born into slavery, poverty, of which some people did try to ameliorate their condition. But there were not too many people arguing that slavery itself was a bad institution. I mean, there was a couple around, but generally that was not the view. You do get a lot of people trying to ameliorate the existence and the quality of life of slaves. So Paul, we could say, was just largely, like everyone else, a product of his day. So we have to accept the difference in time. The other thing we have to say is, Paul does say some things that I think are anti-slavery. In the Pastoral letters, he talks, he bans Christians from being a slave trader. Okay, so that's obviously a negative. If you're banning someone from a certain occupation involved with slavery, that does imply a negative estimation of it. In 1 Corinthians, I don't think he so much affirms slavery as said, look, don't be focused or anxious over whether you can or can't get your freedom. Okay, I think he's more attacking the anxiety about whether you can get your freedom at all. In terms of slaves obeying your masters, a verse that was used repeatedly in the abolitionist controversy, as a way. But I think what Paul is arguing there is kind of like, don't kick the hornet's nest. Okay, that seems to be, particularly if you've got a bad master, don't make life any more difficult than you have to. Again, but you can see how that was horribly abused, particularly in the subsequent centuries. But Paul does say things that I think create a trajectory that is going to lead us to the future. And this is where William Webb's, I think, trajectory hermeneutics are very interesting. F.F. Bruce said, Paul creates a theological world in which slavery is eventually going to wither and die. Yeah. Okay, so what I argue is, look, Paul was not William Wilberforce, but it's because of Paul that we got William Wilberforce. Okay, things like if you prosecute the logic of Galatians 3:28, breaking down the boundaries between slaves and masters. I mean, who was it? I think it was Celsus, the Roman philosopher, despised Christians because he said it was a religion of slaves, women, and children. Okay, yeah. So the Romans despised it because it was a servile religion of the powerless, the have-nots. Yeah. It was a pro-woman, pro-slavery, pro-child relationship. Now, I know that goes against every kind of stereotype we have of Christianity today as being, patriarchal, pro-slavery, and all sorts of, anti-children thing. But in the ancient world, that's how it was perceived. It was perceived as a pro-slavery religion, which is why so many slaves took to it. Now, if Paul was so pro-slavery and if he was so against slaves, why did so many slaves to convert to Christianity? Why did the Romans look down on Paul and others for being pro-slave? Okay, if you look at the metrics of the ancient world, I think Paul is, and the early church was in general, a pro-slavery movement, and they were saying things that were breaking down the borders. They used slavery as a positive term for their own relationship with Christ, creating social situations in which the differences between slaves and masters were obliterated, creating a new currency of equality. And this is where a number of philosophers like Larry Seidentop, I think Tom Holland, and others have pointed out that the language Paul uses creates a social revolution within the Greco-Roman world. And eventually you do get people like Gregory of Nyssa arguing for the abolition of slavery. And then you get the sort of shifting from slavery to the more feudal era. And eventually you do get the William Wilberforces and, the Frederick Douglasses and all that. And I would also add, if you go back, and a great book to read, Lisa Bowen's book on African-American
readings. Yeah.
One of the best books I've read in the last 2 years.
Fantastic.
Definitely read it. Shows how African Americans were definitely aware of how Paul could be quoted, used to justify their abuse and exploitation. But they also saw in Paul language of spiritual renewal and a program for liberation. Okay. Martin Luther King, Dr. King was quoting St. Paul, and he didn't always add a 15-minute caveat saying, I know we all hate Paul, but, here I am. No, he saw in Paul a source for spiritual renewal and something he could rub in the face of white Christians to expose their hypocrisy. So that's how I tend to answer the question of Paul and slavery.
Last question. We have a couple minutes left here. What do you think is, especially for our time now, let's say in your context or my context, where we're not really wrestling with slavery as an institution, what is Philemon's enduring message? What's this letter's enduring message for us? It'd be easy to glide over it and say, okay, we don't deal with formal slavery, so I don't have to take anything seriously from that. But as both and I have a high view of Scripture that this speaks a word of truth to us, how would you just give us one nugget of what you might pull out of this text as a challenge for us today in context where we don't have formal legal slavery?
Yeah, well, I certainly hope we don't have any form of slavery wherever we are in the world. Yeah, I would tend to say that Paul here enters into the messy world of human relationships, of various sorts of injustices, various grievances within a church, and he tries to be a mediator and a reconciler. Yeah. Okay. And he doesn't want to compromise on certain things. I think Paul is trying to show how the Christian view of fellowship, the Christian view of reconciliation, the Christian view of forgiveness and wrongs and right are worked out in a context of a household where you have, I think, a household church, you have slavery, you have debate, you have differences, and you have this difficult relationship. And he shows what the gospel means in that setting, and that's probably a good illustration of what the pastoral ministry is. It's often, putting yourself in the world of messy relationships, of injustices, and speaking a word of truth and a grace, and getting people to often act better than they are, to be true to their own principles, and bringing people together in true fellowship.
Yeah, along those lines, I appreciate an article I read by Tim Brookins, who we both know from Houston Baptist. He wrote an article about different types of use of power in the Roman world, and he talks about the difference between potestas and auctoritas. Potestas is a very heavy-handed form of power. It's very commanding. It's very top-down. Auctoritas is more of a persuasive, soft form of power. And Brookins talks about how Paul uses the auctoritas form of power. Instead of saying, I'm an apostle, this is what you must do, X, Y, and Z, he says to Philemon, I'm gonna give these arguments. I'm gonna persuade you. I'm gonna talk about how great you are as a Christian leader, how much you refresh the hearts of the saints. I look forward to spending time with you. And I think especially in our day right now, where we want to kind of bludgeon people with truth bombs on social media or the kinds of things that we do against each other today, I think Paul's soft form of persuasion is really powerful. I don't think it always has to be that way. I think sometimes we need to give hard words and make hard decisions. But I think as often as we can, be able to do it through persuasion, through good argumentation, through grace and gracious words is a really important message.
And that's probably a good note to end on, Nijay, about of what it means bringing words of truth, words of encouragement, words of justice to a very complicated, messy world, whether that's first century Asia Minor or 21st century Portland and Melbourne.
All right. Thanks, Mike.
No worries. Always good to talk to you, Nijay.
You too.